Do you think that children of illegal aliens should be allowed to attend Texas public schools free, or do you think that their parents should pay for their education?
Would you move the National Guard down to the border in certain precincts that are dangerous?
There are 23,000 Department of Homeland Security. I'd move half of them to Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona if we need the manpower.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
The president is now calling it a national emergency. A caravan of migrants traveling towards the U.S.
They're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Americans are not replacing themselves, and immigration's making up the difference. Why don't we have a right to be mad about that?
You will not replace us.
We're going to build the wall. We have no choice. We have no choice. Build that wall. 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 Build that wall.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Despite these welcoming words on the Statue of Liberty, those who arrived before 1880 considered the influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Asia at best a necessary evil and at worst a menace. Anti-immigrant fears linked to race and ethnicity have a long history in the United States. Natural scientists and social scientists gave credence to the idea that some races and ethnic groups were somehow superior to others. America has a very complicated history with immigration. On one hand, we look at ourselves as a nation of immigrants, and on the other hand, we see immigrants as some type of burden on society. A lot of people might say that these ideas have changed. Like at one point, immigrants were accepted, and now for some reason they're not. But this really isn't the case. America has always had this complicated history, and immigrants have always been looked down on. Every new group that comes in has been looked at as some type of infiltrator to our society. For more than 300 years following the settlement of the North American colonies, most white immigrants were Northern European Protestants. U.S. culture at the time reflected the traditions, beliefs of Northern Europe, mostly those coming out of Protestantism. It's not as though there weren't other groups there, but Protestants made up the largest group of people coming to the New World, and Puritans in particular made up a large portion of those immigrating to Massachusetts. One thing that we tend to forget, though, is that there were also Black American influences going all the way back to the same time. African Americans brought over as slaves tried their very best to hold on to the traditions that they had from their homelands, and these traditions also made it into American culture. We just tend to overlook it because African American slaves were in fact immigrants. They were victims of forced immigration. They didn't choose to come to America, but they were still immigrants nonetheless, and they still brought their cultural norms, their cultural ideas to the United States and made them part of the fabric of our American society. What happened in the latter half of the 19th century, however, was a shift in people coming over from Western Europe to people coming over from Eastern and Southern Europe, and these people brought different traditions than what the Western Europeans would have been used to. From 1860 to 1824, 450,000 Mexicans immigrated to the U.S. as well. So Mexican immigration, which is one of the main concerns that we see in the news now, is nothing new either. The fact that these two countries are so close together means that immigration has always been part of that process. And a lot of the people who became American citizens were not really ones that immigrated to the United States, but ones that the United States annexed along with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That is, people who lived in this area. But there was also immigration from Mexico in general. Many traveled from El Paso, Texas, and from there to one of 3 railroad lines to jobs on farms, in mines, in mills, or in construction. Similarly, despite the Chinese Exclusion Act, tens of thousands of Chinese people attempted to immigrate as well, and some of them came through Canada and Mexico because it was harder to get directly into the United States if you were from an Asian country. However, you could first immigrate to one of the countries that bordered the United States and then from there come into the United States, and that was a little bit easier. In 1910, the government established Angel Island in Santa Fe Bay, which served as a detention center where Chinese immigrants were sometimes imprisoned for months to years while they tried to prove their eligibility to come into the United States. So why were so many people coming to America? One of the things that drives immigration is something called a push factor. This is something in your homeland that is making it very difficult for you to exist in that society anymore and makes you want to go somewhere else to try your luck in a different country. The potato famine of Ireland is one example of a push factor. Because of of the way Ireland was set up, the peasants had very small plots of land, and there wasn't much you could grow on that land except for potatoes. During the 19th century, there was a blight that came through and eliminated large portions of the potato crop. That left a lot of Irish people struggling, and some of them nearly starving. This meant that large numbers of Irish people were looking for a new place to live, and the United States was an attractive option. The other thing that causes people to immigrate is something called a pull factor, and this is why some people might come to the US specifically. What about this new place that you're coming to is so enticing that it inspires you to leave behind everything that you know and cross an ocean to go somewhere else? And in the United States, there are a few factors that were very attractive to people who might be looking to find a new place to live. One of them was the gold rush in California, which made it feel like coming to the United States was an option to strike it rich. Another was that the United States was just looked at as this bastion of religious freedom. So people who were being persecuted for their religion were interested in this idea that America did not have a state religion. And so that meant that you could pretty much practice whatever religion that you want. You guys get to meet my cat. Some other pull factors that made the United States an appealing option were the Homestead Act of 1862, which made Western farmland inexpensive and meant that people had the option to acquire land. Railroads were also interested in bringing in customers, so they offered assistance with fares. They needed customers in the West who would buy their goods, and getting people to come over to the United States and go out west was beneficial to them. Many Norwegians and Germans also settled in the new Western territories, including Iowa, Nebraska, basically the Midwest. Much of the concern over immigrants was felt in the cities, where immigrants were coming in, competing for jobs, and trying to carve out a life for themselves among other Americans. In cities such as New York, Boston, and Chicago, immigrants occupied neighborhoods that took on the distinct ethnic characteristics of the groups that inhabited them. On the West Coast, Japanese farmers joined kenjikai, which provided social activities and helped new immigrants find jobs. So this was a way of building community in the United States for immigrants that were new to the area. They tended to band together, look for other people that shared a similar culture, similar background, and rely on each other for support. Churches and synagogues also provided religious and social activities for urban immigrants. In addition, foreign language newspapers circulated within immigrant populations, which allowed them to stay current with the news of the day. Like other communities with poor, unskilled populations, immigrant neighborhoods did tend to breed crime, and this is one of the things that was usually pointed out as a reason why immigration should be controlled. In fact, it's still one of the reasons that people point out that the immigrant population should be controlled today.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime.
However, this has nothing to do with the fact that these are immigrants from other places. This is more about poverty and about social standing. When you're poor, people tend to be more desperate. There aren't as many opportunities, and in some cases, crime seems like the only option for some people. That doesn't mean that everyone living in these communities was criminal. It means that it was more likely that crime would happen within these communities, which made them more dangerous for the immigrants that were living there. Immigrants were also dealing with very cramped spaces. They usually came over with very little, sometimes sharing rooms with other families. One of the side effects of immigration was also the generational conflict between parents and children. Children who were born after the family immigrated or who came over at a very young age were usually much more Americanized than their parents who had lived somewhere else first. And so they tended to have a societal clash between these two generations when the children got older. One of the concerns about immigration, at least from the perspective of people who are considered nativist, is the ability of immigrants to assimilate. To assimilate means to adapt the cultures and habits of the society that you're moving into. In America, we like to think of ourselves as a melting pot. The idea that all these cultures are different, but they'd all melt together and meld into one kind of homogenous culture. And that's not really what happens in the United States. We can really think about this more like a salad bowl, as though you have pockets of these different cultures and they do influence each other, but we're never going to be one homogenous group. And that's okay. There's something more exciting about that. If anyone's ever been to New York or many of the larger cities, you might be familiar with these different districts which are controlled by different ethnic groups. For instance, in New York, there's a street that has Chinese shops and restaurants, and this is known as Chinatown. If you turn the corner from that street, you'll see what's called Little Italy, and this is exactly the same thing. It has Italian restaurants, Italian-owned stores, and the reason for this is because when people came over from China, from Italy, from these different places, they tended to settle together in groups with people who were similar to them to help each other through the immigration process. So there were two main points of arrival for immigrants, and those were Ellis Island and Angel Island. Ellis Island was in the east in New York, and this is where most people from Europe arrived, and then Angel Island is in the west in San Francisco. This is where most people from Asia arrived. Ellis Island opened in 1892 and was known as the Island of Hope and the Island of Tears. The reason for this is that it could both be a ticket into a new future for a family, or it could be a place where families were torn apart. We tend to think that there were no regulations on immigrants before the modern era, and that's just not the case. There have always been regulations as to who was allowed to come into the country and who wasn't. And places like Ellis Island and Angel Island were responsible for vetting the people coming into the country. They had quotas where there's a certain amount of people from each different ethnic group that were allowed to enter the US at any one time. There were also illnesses that might cause someone to be rejected for entry. So your family might arrive at Ellis Island and some of your family may qualify to get into the country and others might not. So you'd have to decide whether you were going to go back on that boat and go home with the rest of your family, or whether you were going to split up and some of your family was going to go home and some of your family was going to stay. Ellis Island closed down as a port of entry in 1943, but remained a detention area for immigrants until 1954. Making the trip to the New World could be a daunting process, not just because of how financially difficult it was and how emotionally difficult it was to leave one's family and home behind and start over somewhere else, but also because of the poor conditions on the ship on the way over. Most of those who were poor were coming over in something called steerage. This meant that people would be mostly below decks and many people were sick, and this could cause disease to spread on a ship pretty easily. One of the more well-known ships that came across and attempted to bring immigrants to the New World was the Titanic. This was a passenger ship coming from England to the United States and carried 2,223 passengers. However, it only carried about enough lifeboats for half the people on board. The ship hit an iceberg on April 14th of 1912 and sank sometime in the early hours of April 15th. The ship sank in about 2.5 hours, and while this doesn't seem like a very long time, its own designer gave it about an hour to stay afloat, so it did in fact stay above water longer than expected. 1,500 people were killed, and the 705 people who did manage to get into the lifeboats were saved by the Carpathia that arrived in the morning. The thing about Titanic is that it's a good microcosm of how immigrants and people who were of the lower class were treated in general in American and European society at the time. The people who were in first class were much more likely to be able to get on board lifeboats than people in third class. So in this case, the amount of money you paid for your ticket literally could have meant life or death for you. Once immigrants arrived in the U.S., they went through immigration stations such as Ellis Island and New York Harbor. Their government workers questioned them about where they planned to work and live. Doctors also examined them to make sure they didn't have any diseases. Almost all European immigrants were granted entry into the U.S. initially. However, later on, there were restrictions placed on people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, particularly if they were from different religious or ethnic groups. And of course, people from Asian countries were excluded under the Chinese Exclusion Act. Ellis Island was mainly a lot of waiting. There were long lines where people were tagged according to what language they spoke and marked with chalk according to what medical ailments they were suspected of having. There they waited for inspectors to decide their fate. With the huge number of immigrants, inspectors had just 2 minutes to complete the process, and many immigrants had their last names changed by the inspectors because they didn't have the time or patience to struggle with the foreign names or spellings. Immigrants were given tags to pin to their hats and coats. These tags showed the railroad conductors what lines the immigrants were traveling to and what connections to make to reach their destinations. For those that did stay in the cities, especially New York, conditions were difficult, even when it came to finding a place to sleep. A lot of them stayed in what was called a 5-cent spot room. This meant that immigrants with 5 cents could basically find a spot in a room full of people and sleep there for the night. One of the main issues with immigration then and now is the conflict between supposed legitimate immigrants versus imposters. If you've ever heard someone say, oh, well, I and my family came over the right way, but this new group of people is coming over the wrong way, that's not a new argument. People were always challenging this next group that was coming in as being somehow less legitimate. It's this idea of after me, close the door. Immigrants of previous groups tried to separate themselves from the new immigrants coming over. You'd think they feel some type of shared sense of solidarity with them, having been through much of the same thing themselves, but that's not usually the case. Older immigrant groups tend to try and distance themselves from newer groups coming in. In fact, when immigrants distanced themselves from later groups, it was almost a way of solidifying their position as Americans. So I mentioned that there were laws against different types of immigration even as early as the 19th century. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. This meant that almost all Chinese immigrants were kept out of the United States. In addition, they did not allow for the naturalization of Chinese residents, so even people who lived in the United States could not become citizens in the same way that other groups could. These laws also limited the civil rights of those Chinese that were already living in the United States. In 1921 and 1924, Congress passed laws that lowered the number of Europeans and Asians that were allowed to enter the United States. However, it is important to note that all immigrants faced persecution of some type. Some native-born Americans feared and resented the new immigrants. Their languages, religions, and customs seemed strange. They also competed for jobs. This is also an argument we hear a lot of the time when we talk about modern immigration, that immigrants are somehow going to compete for jobs with American citizens and undermine American wages. This is also not a new argument. Pretty much all of these arguments about immigration have been made before. Desperate for jobs, immigrants often accepted lower wages and worse working conditions, and this did undercut the wages of people living in the country because there's always someone who's willing to work for less. This is why minimum wage laws were enacted, to prevent this from being a race to the bottom as far as how low you could pay someone. City populations grew all over the United States in the last half of the century after the Civil War, partially due to the influx of immigrants that were coming into the New World. Because of the Jeffersonian ideal that land was the key to financial stability, cities were not initially very popular. In fact, most immigrants came over because they wanted to own a plot of land that was all their own. However, city life became much more popular as the jobs became centered there. Industrialization in particular was central to changing this. It meant that most of the jobs that people could get would be in manufacturing in the cities. Industrial technology and other advances made cities more attractive and more livable. Cities became an option for African Americans as well. A growing number moved to the northern cities looking for work. Even though a lot of African Americans fled to the north and tried to escape the prejudice that existed in the South, it didn't mean that the North was without racism. In fact, even though the North had fought against slavery, they were still plagued with prejudice and often discriminated against African Americans who were looking for work, seeing them as competition much the same way as they saw immigrants as competition. The cities were also a good way to see the class distinction between those of upper, middle, and lower classes. Middle and upper classes, for example, fled the industrial urban center of the city for the suburbs. Overcrowding within the cities combined with extreme poverty turned immigrant neighborhoods into slums. They also were not very well looked after by the landlords, who were in it to basically get as much money from the immigrants as possible without having to provide the amenities that they needed in order to have a comfortable place to live. In 1890, Jacob Riis, a Danish immigrant, newspaperman, and photographer, illustrated the brutal conditions endured by tenement families. He did this with the invention of flash photography, which was basically able to take pictures of the very dark inside of these buildings. For the first time, middle and upper class people could see the actual conditions that families, men, women, and children were living in these slum areas. By putting all members of the family to work, that means men, women, and children, a family could make about $15 a week. Rent was about $12 a month, which meant that a lot of their money went towards renting in these slum areas, which were the cheapest housing available and the only thing they could afford. Many immigrants worked in what became known as sweatshops. This was a cheap way to produce goods with unskilled labor. Remember, skilled labor is someone who is trained to build an entire product and sell it as their craft. Unskilled labor are people who take on different parts of building a finished product, and they only get money based on how many hours they do that for or how many pieces they're able to do. However, these sweatshops were not at all safe. There were many workers in these sweatshops who called out the owners for the unsafe conditions, and yet they did nothing until tragedy actually struck in 1911. In what became the second worst disaster in American history, second only to 9/11, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company and quickly spread to the floors above. 140 people, mostly teenage girls, died in this fire. Seeing so much death, especially among young women, led to public outrage, and New York City established a Bureau of Fire Protection and required safety devices in buildings as well as improved working conditions. The problem with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was that it did have exits, but those exits had been blocked off because people were more afraid of theft than they were about the actual safety of their workers. The fire escape was not well attached and actually broke down as people were trying to escape. They used the one elevator that they had until it stopped working. The 8th floor was much too high for the ladder to reach when the firemen tried to rescue these women, and so a lot of them had to choose between either dying in the fire or jumping out the window to their death, and many women jumped to their death in front of everyone on the street. It was a tragic, horrible scene to witness and left an impression in the minds of those who had witnessed it or even those who heard about it. After this, safety measures were enacted, although the people who owned the Triangle Shirtwaist Company were not found guilty of any mismanagement because there hadn't been laws in place to protect workers. Therefore, they had not actually violated any laws, so there was nothing to convict them of. However, this did lead to the implementation of laws that meant that such a disaster couldn't take place again. There were other forms of corruption that were much more a part of governance within these areas. Political machines exploited immigrants and used them to gain political power. A boss was usually someone who operated at the head of a machine. One of the more famous bosses was Boss Tweed, who was the head of a political machine in New York City. These machines were often mired in corruption and didn't really care about these philosophical issues that they were campaigning on. They were just mostly interested in staying in power, and whatever was going to lead them to stay in power was what they wanted to do. At the same time, there were people whose goal was to try and reform cities. One way citizens attempted to help immigrants was through the use of settlement houses. These offered a variety of services to the community, including a daycare, cooking, sewing, and secretarial classes. Religious reformers also provided support for civil service reforms, anti-monopoly regulation, income tax legislation, factory inspection laws, and workers' right to strike. The issues that we're dealing with as far as immigration today are nothing new and have been experienced by immigrants going all the way back to the beginning. This political cartoon in particular emphasizes this. You can see many of the topics that we still discuss about immigrants today being discussed all the way back to 1780. First with the idea of a wall of brass that would exclude Catholics, then that immigrants were somehow a drain on the economy, then the idea that immigrants were coming in too large numbers and that the economy couldn't take it, and then finally we see all of them put together. Although really these issues have all been part of our history with immigration, and is probably going to be that way for some time. As you can see in this last picture, there's a child standing there looking at their parents and learning what their views of immigration are as they're being passed down to the next generation. So we might ask the question, when looking back at those inspiring words that we read on the Statue of Liberty, "Send me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuge of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." If that's not real, why do we have it? Is any of that real? Has it ever been? And will it ever be? And if that's not who we are, then who are we? At the same time, our complicated relationship with immigrants is one of the things that clearly demonstrates the difference between American ideals and America attempting to live up to them. No, this country has never had a perfect relationship with immigration. We don't have one now, we didn't have one then, and who knows if or when we ever will. However, the fact that that is an ideal, that we have decided as a culture that immigrants are welcome and that they contribute to our society in positive ways, that we are all immigrants ourselves. These ideals mean that we have something to work for and that we're headed in the right direction. This is what we want to see ourselves as. We might not be there yet, but in many ways we're trying. And that's what's really important, that we continually try every single day to live up to the ideals that we've already set for ourselves. We set these ideals in the Declaration of Independence, in the Constitution, and of course in these immortal words on the Statue of Liberty. The American dream is that these poor people coming from other places could become contributing members to our society, and that we could all be lifted up by this shared culture that we develop together. And that's definitely something worth fighting for and striving for, whether we've achieved it yet or not.